Yeah?
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the future of the format. At one point, I had heard that you were maybe going to do a graphic novel instead of individual issues.
Yeah, well, I've had a few different ideas about how to approach Locke and Key. Like I say, at one point I assumed it would, I assumed I could somehow tell the story in 12 issues, and that's because I didn't understand how little you can accomplish in a 22-page issue. To tell a complete and closed, satisfying story, it's actually very difficult to pack a lot of information into it. It's in some ways, I think that a 22-page comic is like a Shakespearean sonnet. It's a very particular form. It has a very particular structure. There are unspoken rules, and you have to follow them. If you don't follow them, if you break those unspoken rules, readers who read your comic will go, "Ooh, it's a really lousy comic." They may not even understand why it's not good. They just know it didn't work. But if you understand the rules and if you understand the form, there's terrific freedom. It's amazing what you can accomplish in 22 pages. Still, I had a lot of story. So at a certain point I realized I actually had about 30 to 48 issues worth of story. And I did some thinking about it, and I said, okay, I'll do 30 issues and then I'll wrap it all up with one big graphic novel. And that was plan B, but now we're on to plan C. What happened is the more I wrote, the more in love I became with the particular form of the 22-page comic, the monthly comic, which is a dying form. More and more people care about this, the finished hardcover. Less and less people want to go into comic stores and buy a comic month after month after month. But that's how I knew comics as a kid. I've always read comics that way. And it seems like as I write the story, it falls naturally now into these 22-page segments. So I finally decided that actually it wouldn't be satisfying to wrap it up with one big self-contained graphic novel, that I wanted to tell the finish of the story in a series of 22-page increments. So the plan is now for 3 more 6-issue arcs: Keys to the Kingdom, Time and Tide, and then the final story, which is just called Omega. And hopefully that will be it. We started doing a thing on the cover of the monthly where it says 18 issues and then it's all over. 17 issues and then it's all over. So it really has to end in 18, 17. It's like a way of shaming myself, It's possible the last issue, though, will be 72 pages long. If I paint myself into a corner. So that's what's going on there. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, to start off, the first book I read as a trade, and it did exactly what you wanted it to do. I was reading it, caught me off guard, I shut it. I scared the shit out of me.
I love it.
I don't remember what page it was, but it scared the shit out of me. And I shut it. And then I went back to it about 10 minutes later, but it did what you said you wanted it to do. How did you and Gabriel hook up? Because it's an amazing guy. The two of you, it's just art, the story, everything is just amazing.
I love Gabe. I've only met him once. I met him 2 years ago at Comic-Con after we had already done something like 7, 8 issues together. He's an incredibly sweet and kind man, and he's just poured his heart and soul into the comic. And I wound up with him. It was a little bit luck and a little bit foresight. My editor, Chris Ryle, had worked with Gabe for years on various spin-off titles. Like there was a CSI comic for a while, and his feeling was that Gabe was just bursting to tell an original story, that he had, he was a workhorse, he had put together these beautiful sequences, and his characters are really alive. They're very expressive. You can read a lot of, nuanced emotion in their body language and features. Some guys draw comic book characters, and they're like these diesel, ripped. I mean, the anatomy on display is just amazing, but the characters are kind of these stiff and dead on the page. And Gabe's characters aren't like that. They're so fluid and alive. I think that's one of the reasons why it's scary.
Yeah.
It's hard to scare people in a comic. It's easy to scare people in a movie because you have sound. Sound is really what's scary in a film. It's 2 minutes of quiet, and then the chainsaw comes roaring to life, and everyone screams and throws their soda and jumps out of the seat. But you can't do that in a comic. What you can do is people have to turn the page, and sometimes you can have something waiting on the next page that they didn't think was going to be waiting there for them. That's about the only chance you have to scare them. But Gabe is just a master at plotting these sequences, and one of the reasons there's been a lot of interest in adapting Locke and Key to television, I think, is really because movie and TV people respond to the visuals. They look at that, they can see a sequence coming to life on the screen, and that's, and that's all Gabe. And it is a real collaboration. It's not, we talk all the time about the characters and the stories. Gabe generates ideas as well as me. And, I've said over and over, I've learned as much about these characters from the way Gabe draws them as anything Gabe has learned about them from the stuff that I've written. There'll be some bit of body language or some bit of costuming, and I'll go, oh, that's who this person is. There's a character named Scott Kavanaugh, who is this kind of like bald punk with like this burst of hair going out like this, and he's got these John Lennon sunglasses. And as soon as I saw him, I was like, oh, I could write Scott Kavanaugh for another 100 issues. I just knew all about him. So I've been very lucky to work with Gabe. Chris Rao, when I sent the pitch to Chris Rao and I sent him the first script, we talked about a few artists, but I think, as soon as we started looking at Gabe's art, we both wanted it. Yeah, go ahead.
So now that you're doing your own original one, are you completely disinterested on doing a more mainstream, well-known comic book, like a storyline of a superhero or something?
I did, yeah, right. It's interesting. In comics, in when you talk about literature, when you talk about books, and you talk about mainstream fiction, what you're talking about is, we were talking about this. I was in New York City about a month ago on a panel where we were with Kat, as a matter of fact, where this was the topic of conversation. In prose fiction, when you talk about mainstream work, what you really mean is a novel about grad school teacher who's having an affair with one of his students and is going through his midlife crisis. That's mainstream fiction in prose. In comics, mainstream fiction is a story about a dude in a codpiece and a cape who runs around the city bapping people in the face. And everyone who works in comics, this is anyone who writes in comics, I think, if they're not already writing a superhero, one question they get a lot is, which superhero do you want to write? I loved all that superhero stuff growing up. But as a grown-up, most of the stuff I read a lot of comics, but almost none of it involves guys in capes. And I don't really have, any. I'm so slow. I'm miserably slow. I mean, I just had it takes me so long to finish a short story or a book or a comic script. I just did this issue. It's the third issue of the next arc. It's called February. And it went through 8 drafts. I think I broke something in my head working on it. I mean, I did 3 or 4 drafts. It's all supposed to take place in the month of February, and you're supposed to get a day. Every page is supposed to have at least 1 day on it, sometimes 2. And I did it, and I printed up a calendar, and I mapped it all out, and I did it again, and I threw it across the room. I couldn't stand it. I was tearing, I was cutting stuff up and moving it in different orders, and it got to the point where the draft, I finally finished it, and I'm really happy with it. But I sent it out. The name of the latest draft is not issue 3 8th draft. It's issue 3 8th fucking draft. I think with that in mind, I'll probably never write a superhero comic. It's nice to imagine. I'd love to do a Last Days of Caligula story about Superman. Like Superman gets a virus in his head and then goes completely fucking Caligula. And he's in Vegas, and he's just like, having depraved fun with showgirls, and he's elected himself president, and he's got like a horse that he's elected to the Senate, and he would just, that could be really cool, and no one has done that with Superman yet. But I don't think DC is falling over themselves to give me a chance to write Caligula Superman. And barring that, I don't think I'm ever going to have the time to write a superhero comic. I have another comic that's a secret that I decided it's going to be a 4-issue thing, and I decided I would work on this thing, and I wouldn't show it to anyone, and when it was all done, I wanted to have the ending done before I gave it to anyone. But again, it's an original, it's my characters and my ideas, and I think I'm just more comfortable with that. I mean, does anyone, the other thing is, does anyone really care about the superhero guys anymore? I mean, isn't it really about the movies at this point anyway? The movies are just more interesting. I mean, the monthly adventures of Spider-Man at this point, is he still in high school? I mean, I don't know, Yeah. Depends on who's writing it, I guess, or who's drawing it. Millar, I read Millar stuff. But he does, that's what he does, is he does, the last days of Caligula with, superhero stuff. Yeah, that's great.